Okay, so welcome Laura Davis and welcome everyone who's here. I'm Karin Gutman and I want to introduce you to our guest author of the hour. She's a master teacher and best-selling author who has spent over 20 years helping writers find their voices and tell their personal stories. Laura Davis is the author of 6 nonfiction books that change people's lives, including The Courage to Heal, Becoming the Parent You Want to Be, and I Thought We'd Never Speak Again. Her latest book, which is her first memoir, The Burning Light of Two Stars, A Mother-Daughter Story, tells the story of her dramatic and tumultuous relationship with her mother. It gives a no-holds-barred peek at the real woman behind the teacher, the facilitator, and the author. I have to say, Laura, it is kind of fun to talk to you in particular because you're both a teacher and a writer, like me. So we both work with people on telling their personal stories, writing them, uncovering them, discovering them. And so it's fun to talk to you.
The pleasure is likewise. We've tried to, just for people listening, we've tried to schedule this for many, many months. We've talked about it, and I usually teach on Tuesday mornings, but I'm on a hiatus, so this is the first Tuesday I had free
Yes,
when
that's right.
you were teaching and I was not doing something else. So
It's been going on for, probably about a year that we've been working at this. So here we are.
yay!
Yay. Um, so I know you recently had a retreat in Italy, and it sounds like from what you've posted, it was a wonderful success. And I sort of wanted to open our conversation just on this note of working with writers to open them up to their personal stories, to drill down, to excavate. And I genuinely am curious as to how you approach that work. You know, where do you begin with writers, and maybe even sort of drawing on this recent retreat that you've done? Can you share a little bit?
Yeah, it was interesting because, I've been teaching for over 20, like almost 25 years. And before the retreat, I kept saying, I have to plan a curriculum. I have to plan a curriculum. And I had this like uptight tenseness about like, I better sit down and do, and I'd sit down and then I would just get up and do something else. And I just kept not wanting to do that.
Mhm.
Even though I kept thinking I should. And I think I always feel a little anxiety before a retreat starts or a new class, something like that. And I think it's good. It's like that kind of performance anxiety that
Mhm.
keeps you awake and alert and paying attention.
Mhm.
And I did plan, I think, the first class, which is pretty much the same first class I would teach in any retreat. It's mostly how do you set the container for the retreat? And I'm sure you understand this. And those of
Mhm.
you who've worked with Karen, I'm sure have seen her do this, but it's really how do you create a safe space for people? And I feel like in many ways that's my biggest job is to model writing and then to create a space where people feel safe to dig under the deeper stories. I call it the story under the story, and
Mhm.
how do you get people into that material and to feel safe to share it? And there's just this magical synergy of a well-structured writing group where one person shares a story and it cracks open space for other people to share their stories.
Mhm.
Somebody writes about a topic no one else has written about, and then suddenly that topic is coming out all over the place in the workshop. And there's also just the incredible power of being heard and witnessed, which is there's just nothing like it. We don't get heard and listened to in our daily lives that way. So I feel like a lot of what I do is structural. Um, and I think if people were to come into the workshop, they wouldn't necessarily notice the structure, but it's
Mhm.
essential that it's there and then it becomes invisible. And people often say I have a little bit of tough love, I'm very nurturing and sensitive to people, but I also have rules. And I really
Mhm.
make people follow the rules of the workshop because that's what makes people feel safe is that they
Mhm.
know that it's like a good mother. I'm going to protect them and make sure that the space stays safe. So like in a retreat like this, we're in Tuscany and we were eating these incredibly sumptuous meals and, exploring the countryside and going truffle hunting and learning about
Mm.
wine and olives and olive orchards and things. And so our writing class was 3 hours a day, so, and the rest of the time we were doing other things. And that 3 hours was really a place for the group to become very intimate and to
Mhm.
bond. And, the workshop rolled out of the people who arrived. I mean, like this year I had the group was older. We wrote a lot about aging. I mean, we
Mm,
wrote about a lot of things. There were a couple people who were retiring or had just retired. Those issues came up a lot, and
mm,
a lot of grief came out, which I didn't really anticipate. But I think the best thing about being a writing teacher is to be nimble and to respond to what's happening in the room. And I'm sure that you have like an endless, you know, storehouse of poems and quotes and
mhm,
exercises and prompts to
mhm,
meet any moment. It's like, if things are really heavy in a group and someone just read something devastating, then
mhm,
maybe the next prompt I'm going to choose something lighter to kind of shift the energy. So it's almost being like a
mm,
magician or
mhm,
a conductor, really. It's like you're
mhm,
conducting the orchestra, but you're doing it in a way that people don't necessarily notice what you're doing, but you're very aware of the dynamics of that group. So
mhm, mhm,
it's not about just giving exercises. It's really the magic of group facilitation.
mhm, mhm, and
And
this
and
and
how do you
this
create a sacred space?
I
This isn't like, you know, tell me a story about two people trapped in an elevator, and what kind of comfort there you see writing prompts like that. That's not what I do.
Right, right.
Yeah.
No,
Writing as healing is a whole different thing.
mhm, and that's how you view it, writing as healing? Is that really how you approach all of the
Yeah.
work that you do? Yeah.
I mean, not all of it, because I also work with people who are working on a product, like maybe they're coming into a class and getting their work critiqued. And so the focus is more on the craft of writing. But for me, I feel like even writers who are trying to produce work, they need to be nurtured and fed, and not just had it's not just their work being critiqued. They need to be supported in their development as writers. And so it's maybe a little more subtle, but that same aspect of tending to people's psyches and emotions is always going to be
Mhm,
part of what I'm going to do,
mm,
even if it's a class where someone's bringing in a chapter of their novel or their memoir or something.
mhm,
But I
mhm,
think what I really love is the kind of discovery writing where people are excavating their stories. That's really where my heart is.
mhm, mhm, and it's the safety piece is critical. I mean, I really think that is the very what I've heard is the very reason people come back to the workshops that I
Mhm.
facilitate is it feels safe, and it's true. I agree that you know, for some reason, the day and age that we live in, that we don't really listen and we don't really bear witness. Like this whole notion of active listening and bearing witness is not a muscle we seem to have been taught out in the world. Do you agree with that? And why is that?
Yes. I think we're moving too fast. It's just not what our culture does. Our culture is like about, output and productivity and accomplishment and getting ahead. And I mean, and then we're just so bombarded and overstimulated every minute of every day.
Mhm,
Um, I just was visiting my daughter and son and daughter-in-law up in Seattle for the weekend as my daughter was graduating from school, and we all spent 4 days together. And my son had this idea that he's 30. He had this idea like, what would it be like if for 24 hours you wrote down every advertising message that came to you and then he's categorize,
mm,
and it
oh
was
my
just
god.
like I thought you couldn't do it for 10 minutes because it's just
Mm,
ubiquitous, and
mm,
so we don't have the space and the leisure and the pace to really listen to each other. And
mhm,
so that's why when you have a friend or you're in a writing circle and you have that deep listening, it's so precious. And I
mhm,
think the other thing we haven't mentioned that I'm sure is why people keep coming back to your community is that it's a community,
right.
that people get really close to each other. And I think one of
Mhm,
the things I love hearing the most is when someone said, I met so and so and I met 15 years ago at your workshop, and
mm,
we're really good friends, or
mm,
this little group is still writing together, or that people make lifelong connections because
mhm.
when you share that intimately of your lives in a safe place, people get really close to each other. And I like built I mean, yes, I'm a writing teacher. but I really love building community almost
Mhm.
more than anything else.
I feel like
That's like
you
that's the secret underneath what I do, you know.
I feel like in some ways you are my reflection. It's bizarre. I mean, I feel like we very much speak the same language. I'm curious on for you, do you know what can you share maybe one or two things that you do to create a safe space? What is it for? What are the rules in your spaces that really anchor that?
Well, I think, confidentiality, but a very particular, obviously, if you didn't write it, if you didn't say it, you don't share it outside of the group. But beyond that, sometimes in a writing group, someone will choose to share something really raw and vulnerable at a particular moment. They want to be witnessed, they read it. But particularly in a retreat, it doesn't mean that when people are kind of living together, it doesn't mean that then at lunchtime they want to keep talking about that. So
Right.
I make it really clear that you don't bring up anything that someone wrote about unless they initiate the conversation.
Mm,
Because, otherwise, people are curious or they are sympathetic or but I know for me, when I've been in a writing group as a student and I read something very raw, I mean, I can't even look at the other people in the room,
mhm,
no less want them to start asking me questions about it or coming up and saying, have you tried this acupuncturist? It might really help you. Or, yes, I went through that with my mother. Or unless I invite that, I think letting the writer have complete control over when and how they share their material. So
mhm,
that's one basic. And that, like in terms of asking for volunteers to read, that you never would say to someone, "Come on, Ellen, read your piece. It was so great."
mhm,
The
mhm,
little things like that.
mhm.
And I think, part of it is, I have like a gong that I've travel with. This is it, that I've carried around
Nice.
for forever. And it's like I start with a little meditation. I
Mm,
end with a little, also like a little invocation at the end. So there's like a container
mm,
to the class.
mm,
Um, and I think some of it is just it's being responsive to people in the moment so that people know that and that we're not a therapy group, so although people write up it's therapeutic, we're not gonna process people's pain or difficulty. We
mhm,
will witness it. We will listen. I might come over, and ask someone, I might come sit next to some if I'm in person, I might come just put my body next to somebody,
mm,
or check in with them afterwards, or we'll just take a moment. If someone might say they're reading about at this last retreat, I don't know why there were 4 women in that group who had children who had died, which
mm,
was kind of amazing to have that number. And, someone told us wrote about their son, and I just stopped and said, "What was his name?" And then we all just had a moment of acknowledging him and his name. Just little things like that, I think create a feeling of safety. People know that I'm going to, um take care of them, really,
mhm,
but without overly taking care of them.
mhm, mhm,
And I think also things like, asking people to step forward or back, like some people are always eager to read. And so in my introduction, I might say, if that's you, then maybe every third time you have the impulse to volunteer, read, and the other 2 hold back. And if you
mm,
are reluctant to read, move forward. And I'll always say first, is there anyone who hasn't read who would like to read?
mm,
Because I don't always have everybody read every piece. I mean, it depends on the size of the group and things like that. So
mhm,
just,
mhm,
I don't know, things you just learn over
mhm,
many years of facilitation. I think the other thing I tell people at the beginning is to take a risk and step out of your comfort zone, but not too far. Because I
mm,
always tell the story that one time I was
mm,
teaching this Wednesday class, which I've taught for over 20 years, the same class, different people come. And this woman came, she didn't know me. I'd never met her. She didn't know anyone in the group. I don't remember what prompt I gave, but she wrote a really vivid, detailed story about incest with her father, really graphic. And and then she read it out loud. And, everyone held that space for her. And then she never came back to class because she had overexposed herself. Like
mm,
she had
mm,
written about the hardest thing in a group where she hadn't established feeling safe. So
mm,
I tell that example and just say like,
mm,
decide what you're ready and willing to share and go a little bit further, but don't go so far beyond what's comfortable for you that then you have to retract and have a reaction. Uh,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I really encourage people to read. I generally don't force people to read,
Mhm.
so that they always can say, I'm going to pass. But generally, if other people are reading and really sharing, they want to participate.
Mhm. Mhm.
So those
Yeah,
are,
sometimes I'll say, take a leap on the page, knowing that you're not going to be forced to read it out loud. So take that risk rather than writing something that, oh, it's a little bit easier.
right.
This,
Mhm.
um, but yeah, and very much in line with kind of what you're saying as
What else
well.
do you do that I haven't mentioned? I'm really curious.
Um, Gosh, I feel like I'm learning. I feel like so much is in line with what you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, I just one of the things that I liked how you said, unless you've written it or said it yourself, that you know, you don't talk about it outside of the group circle. And I give the example where one time someone wrote about her daughter being diagnosed with autism, um, and it was very fresh. And a lot of people in the group had a lot of experience
Mhm.
with that. And at the break, there was a sort of huddle around her, and that was sort of early on in my teaching
Yeah.
years, and I realized really quickly, okay, I really need to create a boundary, because there's that tricky line between creating community and building community and making these connections and getting to know each other through our stories, and sort of where's and holding the container. Um, so I find it really helpful to hear how you talk about it, because it's there's do you agree that there's a little bit of a fine line there?
Yeah, and I just think the writer needs to be in control of it. And sometimes people really want to talk about, and if you're at like where I was just teaching, at a retreat, there's not just writing group, but then you're hiking together, or you're sitting across from each other at dinner, or you're whatever.
Mhm.
There's a lot.
Mhm.
You're sitting on a bus together. There's all kinds of opportunities to talk, and so these topics that people bring up in class often get talked about. But I think the main thing is who controls the conversation, and that
Mhm. Mhm.
um, I was talking to a really close friend who's dealing with a extremely ill child, and just yesterday, and she said that it's taken her years to come up with what she calls it her index card. And it's like when all these people who don't know her that well but know of her and say, "How's your son?" And she said she finally, every time that would come up, people would bring it up, she wouldn't know what to say and she would just freeze.
Mhm.
And she said now what she has finally come to is to say, "My son is very sick. It's very sad, but I'm okay. Thank you for caring." I
Mhm.
just thought that was, but it's taken her years of inner work to be able to distill her experience into something, a soundbite basically that she could say that is true,
Mhm.
but that doesn't put her in that um, position of having to respond too much. So I think, you know, and also there's also the curiosity. Let's say someone writes about an experience. Let's say someone is transgender and they read a story about being transgender, and there's people in that group for whom this is the first transgender person they've ever met. They might have a lot of curiosity, or
Mhm.
they might want to know what to do about their grandson or their whatever, granddaughter. And that it's not that job of that person to educate the group about
Mhm.
that subject. So I also want to
Mhm.
protect people from that as well.
Mhm.
Um, unless they want to be in that role, but again, it's like, what does that person want? And I'll also check in with people like, how was that? Or I might stop a conversation and say, I just want to stop things for a moment and I want to check in with so and so. How do you feel about this? That kind of thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
But to always be paying attention, to the, and people feel safe. They'll come to me and say, this person broke the boundary in your
Mhm.
class or
Mhm.
whatever,
Mhm.
and then I'll talk to the person personally, or
Mhm.
I might just, as for the group, I would never call someone out in a group, but I might just reinforce for the whole group. Like, I just want to
Right.
remind you that this is really important and here's why.
Yes. Yes. I do the same. One of the things I would say that I do in the workshops is this sort of word critique is, I don't think, useful at all. And so when we give feedback to a writer who's reading either from a free write or a piece that they're bringing in that they worked on at home, is to respond with it's actually from the Amherst Writers Workshop, this recall, like what's strong and
Right.
remembered about it, because that's what a writer's going to build on. And then part two is asking the writer questions. So anything that's sort of could be viewed as a critique is it's almost like the Alex Trebek, turning it into a question that a writer can consider.
Yeah, that's
Um,
really nice.
and I think that's just feels the writer feels like, oh, there's a sort of genuine curiosity about my story, and helping also the writer figure out where to drill down, where to look, and what people are interested to know. Because I think with our personal stories too, they're so close to us. Sometimes it's hard to know what actually people want to hear about. I had one student who grew up on a farm. She was like, I never thought anyone would have any remote interest in my life growing up on a farm. And suddenly there were all these questions, and it sort of opened up this whole world to her. Um, so yeah, asking, I think, is a really big part of what I do. Yeah. Anyway, so let's move into your work as a writer. So correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of your journey as a writer is, I mean, there's a lot to it. I'm going to focus on sort of an aspect of it, which is your own personal story. So is it true that 19 or so years ago, you wrote a story and published a book? I believe it was The Courage to Heal, that kind of upset the apple cart in your family dynamic.
No, the Courage to Heal was published in 1988, so it was
Okay.
35 years ago.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
So uh,
What's the book that kind
that
of,
and that totally, I mean, I ended up estranged from my mother's whole
so
side
it
of the
was that
family.
book. Okay.
Yeah, it was
So,
a it's a I wrote it with Ellen Bass. Many of you
mhm.
know as a poet, but she was my co-author on that book, and it was the first book to guide women, and not just women. Originally, we wrote it for women, but to guide survivors of child sexual abuse on the healing process. Because at the time that book came out, it was groundbreaking because there was nothing about healing in the zeitgeist at all. It was like, this happened to you, your life is ruined, and you're now broken. And our book is, here's the roadmap of how to heal. And um, it was a book that came out. It just took off, and it was like that, the kind of experience. It was like a viral moment before there were viral moments, because this was before the internet. And
You
I
were
ended up
really
being
ahead of your
I ended up
time.
being the poster child for sexual abuse survivors. And at 31, that was really a difficult position to be in, and wonderful to, every writer longs to write something that really has a deep impact on not just people's lives, but the culture. And I had that experience at such a young age, and it's kind of been a weird part of my history to have had that kind of, I guess you could say, it was success. I don't like to really use that word connected to this topic, but to have that kind of visibility and
Mm,
impact at such a young age. And the price was my family
mm.
at the time. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit more about that, your decision to write about it? Did you have any idea of the impact it might have on your relationships, and what was the impact on your relationships?
Well, I had no idea. I kept thinking we had a book contract with Harper, and it was Harper and Row then. So I sort of thought the book would be published, but I always felt like when they saw the book, when our editor saw the book, they would cancel the contract because the book was too radical.
Hmm.
It was just like such a radical thing at the time. It might not seem it now, but at that time it was a incredibly groundbreaking, shocking thing that we basically took on the patriarchy. We took on the abusers. And
Hmm.
it was definitely part of the long thread of feminist activism, and we were one link in that chain. Um, so I was, Ellen always knew it would get published. I was always like, they're never going to accept this book when it comes out, but they did. I don't think they would now, but yeah, at that time, it was published with a lot of support from the publisher. And the whole time we were writing it, I was terrified about mostly my mother, what my mother would do. and how should we react. We were already really at war over the fact of this incest, which was perpetrated by her father, my maternal grandfather. And she and her whole side of the family said it hadn't happened and that I was basically a liar. Um, and I was the only person to this day in my entire extended family who ever came out with this incest. And, generally a perpetrator is not going to abuse one child when he's 70 years old. So I have to assume that this happened to other girls and women in my family, but I'm the only one who ever came forward. And so I was really worried about what would happen. And my worst fears did come true. I was blackballed from, family events. I got nasty letters. I became invisible, and that the most painful person was my mother because had such a difficult enmeshed relationship with her anyway, and um, she was so larger than life in my world. So even when we were deeply estranged, she was living in my head all the time, even though we weren't speaking to each other. So yeah, that led to basically 7 years of having very, very little contact, and the contact we had was very adversarial. She desperately wanted me to recant, and I desperately wanted her to believe me, and that was the stalemate. Um, so yeah, that was a very painful. It was like I gained the world and lost my family, and I think this is a fear every memoir writer I have ever worked with has a really deep fear, and I think you have to be able to ask yourself, what is the worst thing that could happen, and could I live with that outcome?
Mhm.
That's what I advise people, and hopefully that worst outcome won't happen. And in my case, I did have the worst outcome, but this was 35 years ago, and things evolved over those 35 years and changed in ways I couldn't anticipate. And that's basically the story of this memoir, is the the transformation of my relationship with my mother. And I ended up taking care of her at the end of her life. So I never could have anticipated that, and the growth and the changes in both of us that
Mm.
made that possible. But I remember how excruciating it was as a young adult, to really have to make a family separate from my blood family. I had a few supporters. My father was really supportive of me,
Wow.
and a few people on his side of the family, but I was really asked. I already had been in some ways because I was a lesbian. That had happened before. And then they basically accepted that over time. But I had always been making choices that were not traditional. And
Mhm.
I was always causing trouble in my
Mhm.
family.
I have two questions. You said that this book likely wouldn't be published now. I thought it would be the opposite. Why
The
wouldn't that?
Courage to Heal.
Yes.
Um, I think publishers, I mean, just on the fact that uh, they would not take the legal risk of publishing a book like that,
Mm.
um, which,
Mm.
yeah, I just think it just wouldn't happen.
Mm.
It's just such a different world right
Mm.
now than the
Got it.
world then. So yeah, I think we got sued several times over that book, and they went to bat for us and hired a First Amendment attorney and
Wow.
paid half our legal costs. And we actually had a defense fund that was, I think I put that in the memoir. There's a little small scene about that all these women survivors, probably thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, sent in. This was again pre-internet. There was no GoFundMe. There was a PO box, and people would mail these envelopes with like a $5 bill or a $1 bill
Oh
or
my
a small
gosh.
check, and just say, thank you, your book saved my life.
Oh
It was
my
just
gosh.
so incredible. They raised $70,000 that way. This was just a group of survivors who
That's
formed a
incredible.
defense fund for us, and it paid all of our share of the legal expenses. And HarperCollins paid the rest, which also would never happen
Would
today.
never happen today.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I really love how you said while you lost your family, you gained the world. That's an incredible statement. I'm sure it's not the first time you've said that, but I have never heard it said that way. It's pretty powerful. What do you think? I mean, in retrospect, I mean, I guess it's kind of maybe a silly question at this point, given that you know how things unfolded with your mother. But in the sort of, I guess, early aftermath of the book coming out and the reaction and the impact it had on your family, would you have written it?
Yeah, and I'm just looking at the chat. I just want to quickly say that we were sued 3 times. Once was we had in the original edition of The Courage to Heal, we had recommended a list of lawyers that we had vetted with like a 4 or 5-page questionnaire who would handle what was called delayed discovery cases for adults who wanted to sue their families to get money for therapy. And it ended up that one of those lawyers bilked people out of a lot of money, and those survivors sued the New Jersey State Compensation Board, who came after us. That was the first lawsuit. They wanted us to pay what they had paid out. And the second two were um, parents who had been accused of sexual abuse, who, insisted that our book had implanted false memories in their children. And it was sponsored by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which was a huge backlash that happened at the time. And I
Mm,
think they were poised to sue us in all 50 states, but those lawsuits did not succeed. We were exonerated, I guess, on First Amendment grounds. So it was a really it was 30 years ago, because I was at the time I was pregnant with my son Eli, who's 30, and I just remember, Ellen went to bat for us all over the country and fought for us, and I stayed home and was pregnant. It was an incredible
amazing.
gift she gave me.
Were you terrified at the time
Yeah.
by you were? Yeah.
It's hard to remember now. It was a long time ago. Yeah, it was very, very frightening.
Hmm.
Um, the whole ride, it was definitely a ride to go through all of that. And I did. I included just a little bit of that in the memoir because it's a history that I never has been made public before.
Hmm. Hmm.
I wanted
And
people to
so
know.
again, my
Okay,
question
your question
in
was,
the
would I have done it? Yes.
yes, even in that
Yes.
the early aftermath of
Yeah, I
the
mean,
fallout.
I really, I mean, I'm not, I live in California, but I'm not necessarily a really kind of woo-woo person, but I believe that Ellen and I were meant to do that.
Mm,
And I feel like maybe I came into this world to write that book,
mm,
and that we were meant to be the messengers of that message.
mm,
And I feel like that was kind of my dharma. So yes, I felt like I I would have done it.
mhm,
Absolutely. I think now, like if I think about this memoir, which I've just published, about a year and a half ago, um, I'm in such a different place now. Like at that time, at 31, I mean, I started writing the book, I was 28 years old. I was
mm,
like, my daughter's 26, my son is 30. I mean, when I look at them, I think, oh my God, I was their age. Um,
mm,
things were very black and white for me. It was like, we were right. We were telling the truth.
mhm,
My family was in denial.
mhm,
Them, I mean, that was my point of view. And I'm glad it was. I have no regrets. Now I see things in a much more complex way. When I was publishing this memoir, which also, it's not primarily about sexual abuse at all. It's really about the mother-daughter relationship. But I had to tell enough of that backstory for the dynamic between us to make sense. And I knew that my relatives, many of the same who had um, you know, ostracized me 35 years ago, that they would be really upset about this memoir. And they're mostly cousins of mine. So it's my generation, and all the people my mother's age had died out. Um, and I didn't, for like the first 9 years I worked on the memoir, I was like, I don't know if I'm going to publish it. And that was a main reason, was I had actually made peace with all those people over decades of,
mm,
I mean, I'm not going to go into the whole story now, but I mean, I had worked really hard to establish some kind of rapport. And we had all moved on in many ways, and I didn't need any validation from them anymore. And they'd let go of needing me to recant, and it felt like in some ways ancient history. I,
mm,
I wasn't, incest was no longer it was so much in the back fabric of my life. It just, we had other things in common, children.
mm,
And anyway, I was really worried that I would go through that all over again and lose these people all over again. And they're not people I'm particularly intimate with, but cordial. And I think family has become much more important to me. And I happen to have a family that's a mixed bag. If they were all really, really hostile and abusive, and it was um, dangerous or really detrimental for me to have a relationship with them, I wouldn't. But I happen to be in a family where people are some of this and some of that. And I ascertained there was enough value to continue having a relationship. And I was really worried about it. And I also felt like it didn't really matter that I was right and they were wrong. Like, the fact is, I was going to publish something that would bring distress to them, these private people, and my choice to be public and was going to impact them. And I cared about that. And more than I cared about that I was right didn't really matter. But ultimately I decided I needed to tell the story, and I went ahead. And I actually wrote a letter to these relatives right before the book came out. I told them what I was doing. I didn't ask permission, but I basically said, "This is what I'm doing, and I'm really sorry if this brings distress to your lives." I'm trying to weigh my responsibility as a family member with my life as an author and storyteller, and this is a story given to me to tell, and I needed to tell it. So, in other words, my perspective on family and writing about family is evolved over decades because I see things in a much more complex way
Mhm,
than I did
mhm.
in my 20s.
Did any of them respond to you when you wrote
Yeah,
this letter?
there's a lot. Yes. One cousin wrote to me and basically with the same nasty response. I think she said something like, "You just want to sell spots on your trip to Bali." That was her comment. And, like, "I can't believe you." So I got that from her. Her brother, who had been really hostile the first time, wrote to me. Um, and he sent me this beautiful email, and he said, um, "I just want you to know that I'm 80 years old and I've learned a lot of things in life. And one is that people are not just one way. I think you have a right to tell this story and publish it. And I've
Mhm.
just written to Bookshop Santa Cruz to order a copy."
Wow, that just
I
gave
had
me
a
chills.
Yeah, and I had another cousin who was like a generation below me who lives in England, and he wrote and he said, "My wife and my daughter and I were reading your book as part of our family book club." And then we ended up having a Zoom conversation. It was really interesting. So yeah, the responses were um, different. One cousin, if you've read the memoir, there's a chapter where I take my mother to visit her last surviving sister in Florida. My mother's in really bad shape from dementia. It was really incredibly difficult for Karen, my partner, and I to take her on an airplane. And I wrote that story, and the aunt and uncle we visited had died, so I didn't need their permission. And I wrote to their daughter, who was my cousin, who was someone who was really, really hostile about the courage to heal. And I'm not close to her, but I did. I wrote to her. I said, "I just want you to know that I've written this book and I have included this story about your parents." I wasn't asking her permission. I really debated that. I thought, I don't need to get her permission.
Mhm,
And what I said was, "If you would like to name them with a pseudonym, you can do that." So it's like I gave her just a tiny bit of something she could control in a
mhm,
situation where I basically was going to go ahead without her
mhm.
permission. But
And
I wanted,
did she give a
she
pseudonym?
did. She gave me
Mhm,
the names, and then she said, "I never want to talk to you about this again." I said, "Okay." So, I mean, and I felt like that was something I could give her that didn't hurt me at all.
mhm,
And it was some way of not just, I didn't want her just to be shocked and find out because she picked up the book. And I really thought a lot about how to handle these situations. There were other people, like a couple of the cousins I mentioned were actually there in Florida when we arrived. They were there. I just cut them out of the story. I mean, first of all, just as a writer, it didn't make sense to have these two random extra characters in my book that weren't significant in any other place. And I just made them not there. So, I mean, I made some choices to leave out certain scenes or things to make this process easier
mhm,
for me
mhm,
and my family members. And with my immediate family, which would be, my spouse, Karen, our three children, and my brother, who is a major character in the book. I got their permission. I mean, they knew I was working on this at the beginning. They all gave me their blessing. I didn't show them anything until I was very, very far along. And they all got a chance to critique the manuscript. I am using the word
Mhm.
review the manuscript. And I basically said to them, let me know if there's anything you can't live with. That was that was the line I used.
Mm.
And it was good. My kids gave me the most incredible feedback. They were great editors, and they also remembered things with much more accuracy because they're young and they have flexible brains, and I'm old and have a really bad memory. And they just did great. They were so supportive.
That's
Um,
amazing.
my spouse Karen is we've been together over 33 years. She's very private. We're so opposite in so many ways. And she really didn't want me to write about her, but she knew that I couldn't tell the story without her being included because she was part of the whole thing. And so I felt like it was an incredible, generous act of love for her to allow me to publish it.
Mm.
And I also, I didn't really include anything vulnerable about her. Like she's not as three-dimensional as she could be.
Mhm.
And I think she appears as a really ideal spouse, and she has all those qualities, but I didn't include really anything about our marriage or our
Mhm.
relationship or anything other than her being a supportive spouse. And with the kids, basically it's not really them. I mean, I didn't include anything vulnerable about them either. And I think the fact that my mother and I are portrayed so deeply as characters, I felt like I could get away with it. And I think
Mhm. And
um,
that's really the heart of the story.
that's the heart of the story. And my brother, I think, was also really generous to me because my portrayal of him is not very flattering.
Mhm.
And and he really wanted me to write the book. He was very supportive, and he read it, and he said this was really hard.
Mhm.
And he said, "Can you just say a few more good things about me?" And that was actually easy to go back in, and I created him as a little more three-dimensional. He was a musician. I put more about that. The book focuses a lot on all the times he didn't show up when I was taking care of my mother, and I went back and included the times he did show up. And
Mm.
there were really subtle changes in the manuscript, but he felt better and I
Mm.
felt better.
Mhm.
Um,
Did you feel like ever during the writing or after having published it that you betrayed your mom?
no, I didn't.
And and why is that? 'Cause I want to kind of dig into that because I think it seems like something that does come up when it's kind of this very sacred, intimate, I mean, you're writing about such a specific primal relationship and all the intimacies inside of that. Wh- how do you think about that?
Um, well, I mean, I was glad she was dead when I published the book. And I actually made a decision to not publish it until my aunt and uncle died. And they were all octogenarians who were unhealthy in their 80s. And I mean, this may sound crass, but it was just sort of that was a line I drew.
Mhm.
I wasn't going to wait for everyone to die because I'd be dead too. Um, and there's a scene in the book where she basically gives me her blessing. And I mean, she did give me her blessing when she had dementia. So you could say, well, how informed was that? But her comment was, I asked her about writing about her, and her comment was, go ahead, darling. Our story had a happy ending.
Mm.
Just like
Mm.
very touching, very sweet. So I felt like she had said yes. And I also know because I had written about her before, and I wrote another book about reconciliation called I Thought We'd Never Speak Again: The Road from Estrangement to Reconciliation. And that was about 19 years before. And that was much more of a how to book. And the story of my mother and I was like a tiny thread in the book. It was like, 2% or 3% of the book. And it was mostly other people's stories and a lot of how to it was more of a self help book. Um, and she read that book, and the story of her response to that is part of the memoir. Um, and so I kind of felt like I had already gone through this process with her once, and I felt like I could have a sense of what she would say. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I think the main thing is I really wanted, I wanted portray her fairly. And I think one of the reasons it took me 10 years to finish this book is, and I used a lot of beta readers. It's just part of my process. And so early on, and these are, people who would read it and critique it and or give feedback and answer the questions I had at various stages in its development. And I would always ask, how did the mother character come off? And at first people would say, oh my God, Laura, your mother was awful, or I
Mm,
just, I'm so glad I didn't have a mother like you, or, oh, I did have a mother like you, or, um, it was about what a hero I was and basically how awful she was. And that's when I knew I had a really long way to go. And by the time I got to the last set of beta readers, before I was ready to publish, they said, on this page, I hated your mother and loved you. And on this page, I loved you and hated your mother.
mm,
That's how I knew the book was finished.
mm,
And people tell me they love that she's a great character and that they really love her. And also, as um, an early draft I brought to a friend of mine, Susan Brown, who's was a creative writing teacher for 30 years at the university level. And she and I were doing some teaching together, and she offered to read an early draft. And she basically, she's someone who is the antithesis of kind when she gives feedback. I mean, she just ripped me a new one, and basically she said the book was awful. And
wow,
the point she made really was, she just said, you are the hero, and she said, this feels like you're out for revenge.
wow.
And which is absolutely not what I wanted. um, and then she said to me something that I put on my wall for a number of years. She said, Laura, this is not the courage to heal, it's the courage to reveal.
Mm,
And she said, you have to make yourself vulnerable.
mm. Can you give an example of what that meant? Like taking, like, can you describe a scene? It was this, and then I had, and then I
Well, I
went
don't know that what
where?
it was before, but there's an example of a scene where Karen, my spouse, confronts me. And so that's a good example, because what it was that, my mother had moved to California. The inciting incident of the story is, she's living in New Jersey. She calls me and says, I'm moving to your town for the rest of my life.
Mm,
Not like, do you want me to? I'm moving to, and that kicks off the whole story. So she arrives, um, and at first she was living in this little mobile home park on the other side of Santa Cruz, where I live, like about half an hour away. And she already was showing signs of dementia, although I was the main one seeing it. And um, and I was, as the next few years went by, I was always looking for the reasons that she couldn't live alone. So, like, I was always gathering evidence against her, basically. So the evidence might be, the stove was left on, or
mm,
she tried to write me the same check 3 times, or just whatever these things that were signs of her. She missed an appointment, she whatever this, and she can't. And I was sitting at the dining room table one day. This happened in real life. And I was making a list, reasons mom can't live alone.
uh-huh,
And this is a list I wrote over and over again, and it was like, I was trying to gather my evidence of why she needed to be in assisted living, or she needed a different situation. She could not live alone. Um, and I did it. I said I did it to keep her safe. But when Karen came in and saw me doing that, she confronted me, and that's a scene in the book. And she just said, why aren't you building on her strengths? Why are you focusing on her weaknesses? She said, you are putting her in a position, you are um, like insisting that she's somewhere in the future that she hasn't arrived at yet.
mm,
She really defended my mother to me, which was, I think, fantastic. And when I went and thought about that, I realized it was true, that I had always had a vendetta against her, and that all her sins, there were many sins. I mean, she was a very difficult woman, and a very difficult mother in particular. And yeah, she'd done a lot of terrible things, but that I focused on those, and I held on to them, and I honed them, and I would
mm,
repeat those stories over and over. And her good qualities, because she also was a generous person, a loving person. There were good qualities she had. I just, I let those like drip through my fingers. So
mm,
this is an example
mhm,
um, of that. Another was that I would railroad her into things. So I wrote about that I had this quality of being like a steamroller when I wanted something, how I would push for it and manipulate everyone else to support something happening. But those are a couple of the non-flattering qualities that I revealed in the memoir that at first I didn't. At
Mhm,
first it was
mhm.
like, I'm just an innocent, good daughter taking care of my mother. And everyone was saying, oh, you're such a good daughter. And it's like they didn't know what else. And there was also a moment where I lost it with her. I'll let you read the book, those of you who haven't too. I'm not going to detail that, but I really showed my underbelly and it
Mm,
made a much better book.
mhm, mhm. Um, I've spoken to you previously about some of your own kind of learning curve or insights, I should say, that you gleaned from sort of applying, kind of using the raw material of your life and translating that into a memoir and kind of your own, uh, yeah, your own process of discovery of like what it means to write a full length memoir. And do you mind if I just sort of
No.
ask you to speak to a couple of the items I remember you mentioning to me before? You said to me that you learned when to conceal something and then when to reveal something. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a point where I had 140,000 words, which was way too many words. Book
Mhm.
came in at 89,000, which is really the maximum you could ever have for a memoir. Um, but so I had 50,000 extra words, which I think is not uncommon.
Mhm. It's
Um,
not
I just lost the thread. Okay, so your question was,
about,
oh, how to reveal and conceal. So I had a lot of really great scenes. Like I knew I had learned how to write a really compelling scene,
mm,
that someone would be like, they couldn't put it down. It had a strong beginning and middle and end. There was an arc and there was a emotional turn. There was dramatic tension. There was all the different layers of a scene, the events, the inner monologue, the
mhm,
gestures, the texture, the place, the I got really good at writing dialogue, um, and creating so I had all these scenes, but I didn't know how to put them together.
mhm,
Like because I had written them in scenes and workshopped them in scenes. So like each scene, maybe I really rewrote every part of this book 100 times. That is not an exaggeration. So I mean, the scenes were really good, and I knew they were good, and that people would cry and laugh and really respond. But then I had all these scenes, and I didn't know how to make a finished book.
mm,
I mean, I just was like, okay, you can't just put them in a row. There's something else that's needed.
mm,
And so figuring out how to tell the story from beginning to end, although I don't tell it in a linear way, but how to create a story that will be compelling, um, was the challenge. I didn't know how. And I mean, like I said, I've been teaching writing for decades, but this and all the books, the 6 books before this one were all nonfiction, basically information books. I really knew how to write a book like that, but this was a story and it
mhm,
required completely different skill set that I didn't have. And
mm,
I ended up working with a coach named Joshua Townsend, um, who was remarkable. And the thing that's interesting about him is that he's not an editor and he didn't even read my book. He's a theater director and an actor, and he understood storytelling in such a deep way, and that's what I learned from him. And he
mm,
gave me the most incredible assignments to do. And it wasn't like editing. I didn't really need an editor. Like I know how to write.
mhm,
I needed to learn about how to tell a story that would be a page turner. And I did because people tell me I picked up your book. I couldn't put it down all weekend. You don't usually get that feedback for a memoir, but I learned from him. And one of the things was when to conceal and when to reveal. Like, when do you let the reader know a certain piece of information? Um, when do you drop hints of something that's about to happen? Um, and when do you, it's like timing, pacing. How do you juxtapose different chapters together?
mhm,
There just were so many things I learned I had to rewrite the beginning so many times. It was, the book is very complicated. It has several different threads woven together, different time frames, and it was really hard to figure out how to introduce all those time frames and keep people's interest and not have them. One of the questions I asked my beta readers is, would you have kept reading if you hadn't promised me you would read this? And for the longest time, they said no, most of them.
Mm,
Like they would have set it down. It was too frustrating, or they were confused, or
mhm,
they didn't understand why was I so hostile towards my mother, because it just, so getting it that right, the sequence was really, really
mhm,
difficult. And in the very final edit, I did a lot of things, like I had long chapters, I cut them into 2 or 3 pieces.
mm,
So I just did a lot of things to, and the final edit, I think I cut another 12 or 20,000 words. And I was only able to do that because I'd set the manuscript down for a long time. And I came back
mhm,
in, I was just ruthless. I was
mhm,
able to read it like a laser beam, not because of the stories I was attached to, but really looking at a reader's experience.
mhm, mhm. Did you learn anything specific about the conceal and reveal other than trial and error?
Um, I don't know. It's not something I could, if I was looking at someone's work, I might be able to say something.
Mhm,
There's not like a rule, a sentence I could give
mhm. I
those
remember
of you
you
on the
talking
call.
about previously, you needed to give some backstory about you and your mother
Mhm.
and what happened to you, the sexual abuse, and where to place that in the
Right.
sequence,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So, like,
Mm,
here's an example. There's one scene that's one of the most intense scenes in the book. And it's the scene where I tell my mother her father sexually abused her. I do it in a phone call. And basically, she turns on me. And it's a really, really intense scene. And I thought about putting it up at the beginning because people were reading the book and saying, I don't understand why you're so freaked out that your mother is moving across the country. So I felt like I have to explain more, or give an example of more of why we were so deeply estranged and how problematic this relationship was. But I tried it and I realized, first of all, it gave people the impression that the book was about incest, which it isn't. Incest is like really in the background, and then the foreground is the mother-daughter relationship, and that's just part of the context. And also, it was just too intense. It's like you can't include a scene that's that intense until you have readers trusting you and your storytelling, and you have to. So it ends up, it's now like 2/3 of the way through the book. So a lot of scenes, I tried placing them in different places. And sometimes, like in the one of the opening scenes where she calls me on the phone, there's just like maybe a one sentence reference that gives the reader a clue there's something else going on here, but it doesn't go into any details.
I see. So you
Uh,
do reference it. You just
yeah,
don't that full on scene isn't until later. And then it's probably satisfying that by that point because we've been right.
yeah,
We've been sort of
there was another scene where I'm up on a stage at the height of my success with the Courage to Heal, talking to hundreds of people, and my mother calling me and harassing me before, during, and after I'm on the stage. It's another indication of that, and that's the scene I put closer to the front. But again, I was just like, and also
mm,
sometimes if something's too intense, can you cut it back, make it shorter? It's like like, and there were, each scene has to do work. That was something Joshua taught me, is every word in your book has to do some work, every scene, every paragraph.
mm,
And if it isn't working for your story, if it isn't moving your story forward, it has to go. And
mhm,
as writers, we get so attached to. I had some scenes in the book that I loved. There was this one scene I wrote that I loved so much. It was about, I was 21 years old. I visited my father. We were up on a mountaintop in California taking acid together. It was the story about this acid trip and the time I confronted him about having abandoned our family, and I forgave him. And it was a really incredible scene, very dramatic, very evocative, of course. Um, and it was really well written. And I eventually cut it out of the book because the book was not about my relationship with my father. And
mhm,
I was trying to like shoehorn it in, but it broke the pacing of the book. So there were a lot of scenes that I really liked that I cut, because what was the through line of the book?
mhm, mhm,
It's, and there's a workshop I taught down at the San Miguel Writers Conference, and it was like 12 secrets to finished book, like how to go from a bunch of chapters to a finished book,
Mhm.
and there's 12 things I did, that how do you weave it together. And
Mm,
I'm actually going to be teaching a version of that in a pop-up class at the end of the summer, like a half day format.
great.
And there's just a lot of tricks, of what to do, because a finished book is different than a scene.
It definitely is. Um, I wanted to ask, well, there's a question in the chat, but before we hop over to Nancy's question, I just wanted to ask as well. You talked about you also learned how to create a page turner, and I know you shortened your chapters. Is that what the primary kind of mm,
No, that was one of
yeah.
many. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that was one of many. A lot of it is getting rid of extraneous things.
Mm,
It's what I said. Every scene has to work. Everything in your book has to be there for a reason that is creating a compelling story. Like memoirs in particular, I read a lot of them, and I find a lot of them have all this history. Like, and this is the history of my mother's side of the family, and
mm,
this is the history of my father's side of the family, and you know that's great if you're writing a book that is primarily family history, and it's what you want if you're writing a book that's more for your family and your progeny and your descendants to know about the family. But for people who are not connected with you, often there's so much more of that than is actually necessary.
mhm,
So it's sort of like, what is your story about? And it has to be about more than this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened.
mhm, mhm,
It can't be episodic and have people, that is not a page turner.
mhm,
So it's a lot of it is like, you plant a seed for something, someone is waiting to find out what it's just, it's a lot of the skills someone would have who writes a thriller or a mystery, and it's taking
mm.
those same kind of skills and applying them to a memoir.
And the threads, and weaving these different, because it's not a linear telling. Did you map those out? Did you write them separately? How did you work with the
Yeah.
various threads?
So I'll just describe the threads.
Okay.
There's the main story line starts with my mother's phone call, I'm moving to California for the rest of my life. It ends with her death.
Mm,
And those chapters track, her announcement, my reaction to it, her arrival, her decline. It's a lot about aging. It's a lot about dementia. It's a lot about being a caregiver. And it's a lot about my brother not showing up. I mean, there's a whole thread that's basically the 7 years from the time I get that phone call until shortly after her death. So that's one thread. Um, and then there's, all the stories from the past, that they're more than flashbacks in this book. They're actual scenes. And it gives the trajectory of our relationship up until that point. And it's not sequential. Um, so that's another thread, I guess you would say, is all that backstory. Although it's not backstory, it's story, it's full
mhm,
storytelling, it's full scenes. And then the third element was, my mother and I had this incredible correspondence in letters. And when she died, I went through my things, and I found this. I had these two file folders that were about this fat each, so like bigger than my Zoom window, of letters. And I kept all the letters I had written to her, drafts of the letters I didn't send, and all the letters she had written to me, or not, and there were some missing. And when I went through her things, she had a shoebox, and she had done the same. And
mm,
so when I put hers and mine together, there was this very full record of this incredible correspondence. And the thing that was so challenging for me about it is, when I read those letters, they told a different story than the story I had been telling for decades. My mother and I never spoke for 7 years, and then it's like there was these letters going back and forth that entire time. So for me, one of the threads in the book is I include some of these letters. At first, I wanted to include a lot of them, but I ended up cutting them back. And a lot of people told me to get rid of them altogether because they weren't as alive, but I kept them very drastically edited with a lot of commentary from me. And I use them as a way to reflect on the relationship from the future, which is like me now writing it, because there was so much I didn't understand about the relationship, and those letters having to confront the fact that my truth was only partly true, um, is a thread in the book. That this
Mhm,
idea of, there's a quote, I think I have it at the very beginning of the book. Um, Every time I look in the rearview mirror, the past has changed. So that thread of memory, which of course I'm dealing with my mother's failing memory throughout the book, but my memory and how my memories are incomplete or slanted or reinforced into the things I wanted, where I'm the hero. Um, that whole thing of confront that I had to do in the process of writing the book, of confronting that the truth I thought was the truth was not the whole truth.
mhm,
So
mm,
I included some of those letters to make that point. And also, it's the only place where my mother's actual voice is in the book.
mhm,
Otherwise, I'm channeling her voice in all the dialogue I wrote. I mean, I don't remember exactly what she said, but I know
mhm,
how she talked.
mhm,
And I think I was able to really recreate these incredible fights we had and all kinds of
mhm,
scenes, things she
mhm,
said many, many times. But in those letters, it's purely her voice. I mean,
mhm,
I didn't, the letter might have been 6 pages long and I might include a few paragraphs of it, but she gets to have a voice.
mhm, mhm.
So those are the different threads. And it was very hard to figure out how to integrate them.
Yeah.
Um, Really difficult. And they are, I like books that move in time, like you're reading something and then you're in a different reality
Mm,
and then you're back. And that helps create momentum.
mhm,
So that's what I did. But it was a lot of trial and error and a lot of getting feedback and a lot of setting it. I think one thing I really recommend is if you're deep in a project, you need to set it aside for a long chunk of time and come back to it fresh.
mhm, mhm,
Otherwise, you're just going to be too in the weeds.
mhm. Yeah. So, I mean, it wasn't really mapping out the threads in any particular, like, in an outline form. It was really about working
No.
with it on the page.
Yeah, or like printing the things out and,
Mhm,
physically moving them around. I use Scrivener,
mm,
so some of your people may use Scrivener, and so you could kind of in Scrivener, which is a program, you can, show different things in different sequences without
mhm,
messing up your whole manuscript. So
mhm,
I just tried a lot of different things.
mhm,
But that's part of why it took 10 years. There were a lot of reasons. Some of it was just dealing with my family and my fears. Some of it was I had to be able to get to the point where I really could tell the truth about myself. Um,
mhm,
I had to create my mother and I as full, complex, flawed characters, both of us. And then I had to figure out how to structure it.
mhm, mhm,
All those things took a really long time. And the story I wrote is not the story I thought I was going to write. Just and I think that's for me, that's the pleasure of memoir. It's not like I'm going to record what I remember and just put it
mhm.
down. It's like it should be a process of discovery. I mean,
Right.
to me, anyway, that's the value, is that you write memoir and you discover whole new aspects of your life and your experience, and you get to, it's like you get a completely different viewpoint than the kind of rote story, habitual way you've been telling or holding a story for a long time.
Did you know that it was still going to be about your relationship with
Yeah,
your mother?
always. I was very
Yes.
clear that that's what I was writing
And
from the beginning.
what did you think the story was going to be about originally?
Um, I don't know. I always knew it would be in a way an imperfect reconciliation story.
Mm,
That is the story I wanted to tell.
mm,
Um, and I wanted it to be really complex. Like
mhm,
this isn't like at the end you take out the violins and everything is
mhm.
resolved. It's like I wanted to write a really complex story because our story was incredibly emotionally, spiritually complex. And you know, it's interesting. It feels less complex now. My mother's been dead. It'll be 9 years in July, and my relationship with her now feels quite simple. Like I
mm,
think of her with so much love and tenderness. And you know, I've thought about this a lot. I think in part when someone has died, they're no longer around to trigger you anymore. You know, so um, I just get to have the relationship in myself, and there's so many things in my life that I appreciate that I feel like came from her.
mhm,
And as I get older and I'm dealing with a lot of issues around my own aging and my own future and fears about my own future, I I think about her in a whole different way.
mm,
I wish she was here to talk to, you know.
mm,
Um,
mhm,
and also, you know, I think writing the memoir helped me have I already felt like I was at peace with her when she died. Like I felt like things, I always said like the water ran clear between us. Like after so
mm,
much difficulty, by the time she died, you know, I felt like resolved. But
mm.
then I felt even more resolved from writing about her, and I just saw things in a different way.
But when you
Also,
did,
just like an appreciation of her, you know, it's like for so many, most of my life, I saw her as this terrible mother. You know, I
mhm,
saw her in that one role in relationship to me. I always had tons of friends who thought she was the best person in the world, but they
mm.
weren't her daughter. Karen loved her, you know, she was her daughter-in-law. It was a really different kind of
Is
um,
that is that
relationship.
is that what shifted in terms of what you thought you were going to write versus what you ended up writing? Is this sort of other dimension that came forward when you were reading the letters? And
I didn't know that I would be writing about how hard it is to tell the truth, and
mm,
how much we lie to ourselves, and how much memory is imperfect and
mm,
shaped to serve us. You
mm,
know, I didn't know that that would be a thread. You know, that's something. But and I think it's a really, and I think it adds complexity to the memoir. You know,
for sure
I
it
like that
does.
that's there. Um,
Mhm.
you know,
So there are a couple questions here. How do you, Laura, write the difficult memories without experiencing the PTSD, depression?
yeah, I think that's really hard. I would say I didn't succeed very well. I mean, I think my experience of writing the really hardest scenes was I had to be willing to go back in there. And you know, there was actually a woman on this retreat that I just taught, one of my students, who talked about writing. She had written a memoir. She talked about working with this therapist who helped her do this thing. When she used EMDR, and she also did this thing where she would like see the scene from a distance and then write about it. And I mean, I thought that was great for her, but for me, I had to go back in and be willing to really re-experience the whole thing in
Mhm,
order to write about it. So I think for me, it was more around self-care on either side of it, like making sure that I was well resourced, both internally in terms of my own skills at dealing with really difficult emotions, and that I had a plan um, for um, taking care of myself. Like I did a lot of, during the course of this, a lot of solo retreats. There's a monastery in Big Sur, a couple hours south of where I live, that I would go to for like 3 or 4 days, and just
mm,
they had these like really funky trailers, and I would just hole up in one of these trailers because I found, because I am teaching all the time, I just it's really hard to write and teach simultaneously, I find. So I would go on these retreats where I would just be working on the book without anything else happening, no internet or anything. Um, and I would just get really, really deeply involved, and I would um, I wrote the most difficult scenes in that kind of setting.
mhm, mhm,
And some of them came out in a writing class where I was a student, like some of the work that then had to be polished. And I find that it's the first time a story comes out that it's really, really difficult. Once I start editing it and
mm,
crafting it, I just get more and more distance from it. And then it becomes like just a piece of story. Like people often will say to me, you know, since this memoir came out, like, I can't believe how vulnerable you are, you make yourself so vulnerable. And I don't really feel like I'm making myself vulnerable
Mm.
because I'm being really intimate about things that happened in the past
Right. That's not
that
you
I've already
today, right?
resolved. So for
Yes.
me, it doesn't feel vulnerable. If I was
Mm.
writing about the deepest challenges I'm having right now, that
Mhm.
would be really different.
Mhm.
And I do write about them, but I don't publish about them generally.
Mhm.
I might share them in a writing group or with a friend or, um, use them that way. But
Mhm.
um, yeah, so it feels like by the time it's that initial writing that is so challenging and difficult. And,
Mm.
with my students, like I teach a grief retreat every year. Um, and people are writing, they're excavating a lot of really painful stories often.
Mhm.
And we talk a lot about self-care, and the way that the structure of the retreat is, it builds in a lot of time for people, so it's like people make a plan, like if a lot of difficult things come up, this is what I'm going to do. And they think about that at the beginning, like maybe for one person, it's like, I'm going to put my feet on the earth and I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to ask for some extra support, or I'm going to, after I've written something really difficult, I'm going to use a prompt like, what gives me strength,
Mhm.
or the
Mm.
ground on which I stand,
Mm.
or I'm going to write in detail about something that brings me joy.
Mm.
And so, I teach people a lot of how to take care of yourself when you're excavating the really difficult material. But I think some of it you just have to go through it.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think I have sometimes, occasionally, I've had a student who's writing a really difficult memoir and ultimately walks away from it because it's just too painful. It's just too difficult, and they realize that they've moved on from that difficult experience they're writing about, and that they really don't want to spend 2 or 3 years,
Mhm.
and that, yes, it was therapeutic to write what they wrote, but that they really want to move on and do something else. And it's often a really difficult decision.
Did
So
you feel that way ever, about
I
this? Like,
wanted to walk away from it a lot of times. Not because it was too painful, because of my family and because I felt
mm,
inadequate to write it. I just felt like I didn't have the writing chops
mm,
to pull it off. I just couldn't figure out the structure. Um, those were the reasons that I wanted to give up.
mm,
Um, one time, and this is just an aside, but I caution people to not share their work prematurely with anyone involved in it.
mhm,
And there are exceptions to this, but like, so I don't share my writing with Karen, my spouse. She doesn't read my books. And that's a whole other story. We actually had to go to therapy about that once. And I finally really saw her point of view. Um, but she had to read this book because she was in it. I wanted her to, and she wanted to. But I didn't share my writing with her. But one day I wrote a scene, and I was so like, I thought it was really good, and I just really wanted to share it. And I walked in the house. I said, "Could I just read you this one little scene?" She said, "Okay." And I read it to her, and her comment was, "Laura, are you sure you're not just writing this book for revenge?"
mm, mhm,
And she didn't say it to be mean. It's just what she thought.
mhm.
And then I didn't work on the book. That was it for about 8 months.
Oh, wow.
Because I was so devastated, because it's like,
Yes.
am I doing this for revenge?
Mhm,
I don't think
mhm.
so. And of course I value her opinion. So you have to protect yourself. Um, I think that's
Yes,
important. I don't know
8
if I
months.
answered the question.
Um, I think you did.
Okay.
Yes, and more. Um, so I wanna, respect your time, Laura, but we have, can you handle 2 more questions?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay, amazing. So this is an interesting one. One of the people here said that she's reading your book and she was surprised to see how your life began in an incubator. Do you ever address in your writing how this may have influenced your relationship with your mother?
Not more than I do in the memoir. So if you're just it does come up in the memoir. So if you haven't read the whole thing, it is something that comes up. But I would say that, it's interesting because at the time when I was uh, remembering the sexual abuse, it was the most consuming thing in my life for probably about 5 years. I mean, it was all I talked and thought about, and I never thought I would get past it. And I thought it was like, if you said, "Who are you?" I would say, "I'm an incest survivor." That was my sole identity. I mean, it was just like loomed so large. And now if you were going to ask me who I am, I probably wouldn't even put it on the list. I mean, it's in the tapestry of the cloth that shaped me, but I'm a
mm,
mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a
mm.
writing teacher, I'm a hiker, I'm a swimmer, I'm a lot of other things. Um, and I probably wouldn't say that. Um, I'm sorry, what was your question? The question was,
Just in terms of you being an incubator
oh
baby.
yeah. So what I was trying to say is that that was like dominant thing. But I think if I look from the perspective of where I am now and I think about the different things in my life that have shaped me, I would say my premature birth and the death of my twin sister
Mm,
um, has been the most significant
mm,
thing that has shaped everything about me.
mm,
And I um I probably will write more about that, or write, maybe I'll write a novel about twins. I'm so intrigued with that early loss and how incredibly significant it was. She was an identical twin,
mm.
and my mother didn't know she was carrying a twin.
Oh my
She
gosh.
just knew I was very premature, and she thought she was losing another baby. She'd had two late miscarriages already. And then I was born, and the doctor said, "Hold on, Mrs. Davis, there's
There's
another
enough.
one coming."
Oh my gosh. It's
And then
crazy.
she only lived 24 hours. So I feel like that being born into loss in such a deep way, I feel like
Mm,
has shaped everything about me.
mm,
Um,
mm. Even though she didn't know she had
me, I mean, it's
twins.
shaped me.
Mhm.
Well, the thing, that's one thing
Oh, right, right, because you shared
I was,
that
I mean, we
space
were
with
the
her.
same
Yes,
cells.
yes.
And I think this is something I really appreciate about my mother, when I think of on the positive list, is that she named my sister. She felt it as a loss, and she gave her a name,
Mm,
and Vicky. And I am so grateful that she did that, and that she, throughout my life, we talked about the fact that I had about Vicky, and no
mm,
one else. There's no one else in the world that I ever shared that loss with, and she understood that it was significant for me. That was an incredible gift,
mm,
because otherwise it was just like, be happy this baby lived, and no one would have ever mentioned it again. My
mhm,
father never, he didn't relate to it at all. No
mhm,
one did, except for my mother and me.
mhm, mhm. And the final question here, which I think is fun. What are some of your favorite prompts? I mean, Laura, by the way, on her website has endless prompts available to her community. It's such a generous offering. Any that come to the top of your head?
Yeah, the ones I've been really enjoying this year, I mean, I sort of go through cycles. The one that I've really loved the most this year is "This is the way things are right now." And, I think we spend so much of our lives wishing our lives were different than the way they are, wishing things could be different. Our relationships, our health, our jobs, our finances, the politics of, Donald Trump. I mean, we wish things could be different. Climate change. I mean, on every level, racism. We wish things were different
Mm,
in our own lives and in the life of our planet, our country. And I think it's a meditation practice to write to that prompt. This is the
mm,
way things are right now. And I give it as a repeating line, so that each paragraph or stanza starts with that line. This is the way things are right now. And then it ends with that line too. And you could write this every day, the same prompt, you would get really different answers. And um, I think the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about is just,
mm,
how do we live in a world where there's so much grief, so much reason for grief, and still experience joy? That's another little class that I'm teaching this summer, and I think it's really challenging. How do you not just become numb, or medicate ourselves in all the different ways we numb ourselves out? How can you stay aware and awake to the trauma, tragedy, grief, and dysfunction of the world, and still feel, and not just be so devastated, and still experience joy?
mm,
So you could take that prompt, and the first time you use it, it could be, "This is the way things are right now." And then you write in detail for like a paragraph about something really challenging happening in your life or in the world. And then the next one is, "This is the way things are right now." And then you write about like the incredible tulip that's blooming right outside
mm,
your window.
Mm,
and then the next one might be, about your dying mother and the stress of being a caregiver.
mm,
And then the next one maybe is about like how it feels to dive into the swimming pool
mm,
and that incredible feeling of water around your skin. And if you just because that holding those two opposites, or those,
mm,
they're not even opposites, those two um, polarities, I feel like that's our spiritual practice right now.
mm.
So that's how I like to use that prompt. And so
That's a
that's,
beautiful meditation slash writing practice. I
yeah,
love it. I feel like I would want to just go get a new journal and title it,
this is the
"This
way
is the way
things
things
are.
are right now." Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's,
Other ones I really like are, especially at a retreat, when a retreat has been cooking for a while and people have been uh, writing, is just, I am letting go of, and just
mm,
what's it called where there's a word for it,
what,
not a testimonial, Karen, help me out,
what are you going for?
like
I'm missing.
a it's a statement that you make. You would stand up and say it it's like a
Oh,
proclamation,
like an
a
affirmation,
manifesto. No, a
a manifesto.
manifesto.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm letting go of.
Mm,
That's at the right moment. That could be a really
mm-hmm,
great prompt. Another one that I've used a lot is, "This is how you do it." And you could use that prompt about anything. So someone could be writing about, um, how to train a dog. This is how you do it, and you go into all the details of how to do it. Or it could be,
I hear this song and the rock song in the
it could be,
background.
this is how you sit at someone's bedside when they're dying. This is
Mm,
how you do it. It could be how to cook a pot roast. It could be,
mm,
this is how you retire after 30 years. This is how you do it.
mm,
Um, this is how you cut off a friend who has been draining you for 20 years. This is how you do it. And it's such
mm,
a great prompt. And it could be about, like at a grief retreat, people will have different themes they're writing about, and often will bring up that prompt closer to the end when
mm-hmm,
they've been working on whatever it is, their retirement, empty
mm-hmm,
nest,
mm,
just all the different issues of transition. This is how you face uncertainty, and then I'll give that prompt. And then it's like a way for people to sort of take all the things they've learned that week and put them together on paper. This is how you do it. And it's like an affirmation
mm,
of, this is what I've learned. This is my wisdom. This is what I've
mm-hmm,
learned about this really difficult thing I've faced, or
mm,
this thing that I'm an expert in. This is how you do it. It could be funny, it could be poignant, it could be serious, but it's a way to say, this is the body of knowledge I have and I'm claiming it. This is how you do it.
mm.
Those are a couple of my favorites.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That's so, I want to write on all of them today. And
Me
no,
too. I want to too.
really, they're ones that you can return to.
Yeah.
Um, thank you for that. Laura, thank you for all of this. And I'm so glad we finally did
I
it.
know, me too. I
Yeah.
love, and thank you for everyone who's listening. It just feels like we're having this really great conversation and people are listening in.